Before we start, tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now in your city. I read every single one, and the places and times always help me picture who is in the room with us while we open these old files. Bay Saint Augustine, 1907, did not advertise itself as a place that graded women. It sold itself as a place that canned fish. The whistle of the steam boiler could be heard from the marsh at dawn, and if you stood on the plank walk that cut across the flats, you could watch the men unload snapper and mullet while gulls screamed over rust-red barges. Hiring day at the Gulf Consolidated Cannery was the 1 hour when the noise dipped. The foreman put a chalkboard on 2 crates out in front of the office door, wrote women needed, fast hands, decent pay, room and board, and then he waited. They always came. I know this because I am speaking to you with the company's own paper in front of me. The State Labor Inspector's Ledger, Shelf 7, Box 3. The Cannery's Payroll, Spring Quarter, 1907. The boarding house register with lines that run slanted because the pen was cheap and the matron's hand was fast. And then there is the book no one was supposed to see. It is bound in brown oilcloth and labeled with a number that looks like a church pew assignment, 428R. Inside are pink cards, each one with a woman's name, age, and an initial grade in a cramped, neat script. The company called it the Morality Registry. No one outside the office used that phrase. The women called it the color test, and you will understand why. On the first Monday after the spring storms, a train car opened and delivered 7 new hires along with a handful of men and a crate of clanking tins. Among the 7 was a 19-year-old from Iberia Parish named Ana Morales. Her English was quick but careful. She had an older cousin already at the cannery, a woman who signed the boarding house rules with an X the previous year. The cousin told Anna to keep her head down, say yes to the matron, and never argue about your shift. That cousin's signature appears 3 times in the boarding house ledger with small fines beside it, 50 cents here, $1 there. The margin note reads, hair length violation and lights after bell. You begin to see how the company understood order. The hiring room was a square with a single fan over the desk. Behind the desk sat the plant superintendent, Luther Pike, a man with the sun-black sleeves of someone who pretended he still worked the dock. He called each woman by name, cross-checked the county list, and slid forward a form. The form was a waiver that said the company could dock board and fines from pay. It is not unusual to see a clause like that in 1907. What is unusual is the second page. That page says that women hired into the cannery's boarding house agree to an after-hours fitness check conducted by the house matron and the company doctor within 48 hours of arrival. Purpose, health and sanitation. It is signed by Pike, and under his name is the neat, even signature of Dr. Talbot Reeves, M.D., and then the sharper, faster signature of Matron Corinne Laveau. The first night after hiring day was always busy. The fish came in heavy, and the temporary platform over the north drain flexed under the weight of 24 men and barrels. In the dormitory above the company dining hall, the house matron walked the hall with a brass bell that she did not ring. She tapped the handle lightly against the door jambs and called each woman to the end of the hall, where the lamp was already lit. The doctor's bag was there. A ledger was there. An enamel basin was there. The door closed and locked. These details do not come from rumor. They come from a survivor statement taken in 1912 when 2 sisters, whom we will meet later, went to the county courthouse and swore an affidavit that begins with "we were told it was only for sanitation." What happened in those checks followed a script. The doctor asked questions about cough, bleeding, fever, and then the matron measured hair length, hemlines, and the number of pins and buttons a woman owned. The matron had a list she called the housekeeping rule. If a woman brought too many personal items, she was fined for clutter. If she brought too few, she was flagged for slovenliness. The matron lifted chins, checked fingernails and elbows, and made a note if a woman wore a cross or medal. The doctor then performed what he called a hygienic exam. He never used the word moral, and he never wrote the word virgin anywhere I can find. But the pink cards sort women into 3 letters: C, P, and S. The ledger key appears on a loose leaf folded twice and tucked into the back cover. C means clean. P means problem. S means special attention. I did not invent that key. It is here, in the doctor's hand, with the dispassion of a man labeling jars. How did those letters change a woman's life in Bay Saint Augustine? If you had a C on your card, you started on the line that week and found yourself in the day shift that stayed in the main shed. You were assigned a bunk close to the windows and a trunk with a workable lock. You had the right to a matched pair of oilcloth aprons, and your docking sheet was ordinary: board, soap, thread. If you had a P, you were on nights. Your bunk was by the stairwell where the boards rattled, and you were moved more often. Your docking sheet accumulated strange entries: visiting fee, $1. Lodge contribution, 50 cents. If you had an S, you did not touch a knife for at least 2 weeks. You did errands for the office. You assisted the matron. You were called to the river room. The river room is not a romantic name. It is what the matron wrote at the top of an inventory: river room lamp returned, wick cut. On the property map, the river room is a 1-story outbuilding on pilings back behind the boarding house, at the end of a planked path that leads toward the marsh. It had slatted walls, a table, 3 chairs, and a line with 5 hooks. There was a single lantern in a bracket and a narrow side window. If you stood in the doorway, you could hear the river slap at the pilings and the frogs that sang all night in the reeds. The inventory for that room includes a tin lockbox and a leather envelope. The lockbox shows up later in the burned edges records of 1913. The envelope shows up overnight in 1908 in a line item called Replacement After Incident. The more you read, the more you understand that the river room was not for health and sanitation. It was where the registry became leverage. Anna Morales, on her second night in the house, was called to the end of the hall. She signed the sanitation page. She stepped into the lamplit room. She was handed a robe. The matron took her bundle and set it on the table. The doctor spoke in the flat way of a man who does not like to be there, but is paid too well to say no. The exam was not graphic, but it was invasive, and this matters because people will tell you nothing illegal happened as long as it was for health. The way the doctor made the matron stand beside him with a ledger open to a blank line was not about health. The way the matron asked Anna whether she had kept company with any man on the journey was not about health. The way the matron wrote S on the pink card and then told Anna to report to the office in the morning with her trunk key was not about health. I can tell you exactly how an S turned into money for the men who ran the place. I have the dock sheets. I have the envelopes. When a woman got an S, an envelope appeared in her trunk by the end of the week, under her folded apron. It was addressed in the matron's neat hand. Inside was a folded card printed with company rules and a handwritten line at the bottom that read, "You are under discipline." It was signed with an initial, not a name. The same envelope contained a second paper, the color test. It was a small square of heavy stock with a pale pink dye stained into the corner. If that paper gets wet, the color runs dark. The matron's note said to return the paper dry on Sunday night with your signature. Women who brought the paper back smudged were put on the night list again and again. The color test had nothing to do with health. It was a way to see who the matron could control, who asked for this system. The answer appears in the minutes of a lodge that met in the back room of a feed store. The lodge kept a ladies' committee that, on paper, raised money for the orphans of drowned fishermen. Several of the men who served on that committee also sat on the cannery board. When the doctor proposed the registry, they approved the expense. The minutes say it discourages nuisance and keeps order among the girls. The men who signed that line were deacons and aldermen. They all had daughters. They all attended a church that made much of purity. The registry folded that language into a company tool that could take money from a woman's pay, assign her a bunk, and decide whether she worked where the foreman could see her or where only the night-loading crew could. Did any woman refuse the exam? Yes. A woman from Pascagoula named Mavis Dunn refused 3 weeks after Anna's arrival. Her refusal was not dramatic. She said no and asked to see the superintendent. The matron wrote refusal in the margin. The doctor wrote, cannot certify. The superintendent wrote discharge. Mavis was paid $2.08 on a Friday afternoon for 3 days' work and told to leave the premises before sunset. She left with a girl who would later write a letter that begins, Mavis did not understand what that little square of paper meant, but she knew a leash when she felt it. That letter sits in an envelope addressed to the county attorney with a stamp that was never canceled because it was never mailed. The registry did not work by itself. It needed the boarding house. Corinne Laveau, the matron, was 37 in 1907, a widow with a face that looks stern in the only photograph we have of her because long exposure makes everyone look stern. She wore a watch on a chain and kept a ring of keys at her waist. She was meticulous. Her kitchen inventory notes eggs counted nightly and matches accounted for with names. She also kept a separate notebook in a drawer with initials, dates, and a mark that looks like a check. When a woman was friendly with a foreman, Corinne wrote the mark. When a woman let a sailor walk her to the gate, Corinne wrote the mark. When a woman kept her head down and said yes and brought back a perfect dry color card 3 Sundays in a row, Corinne wrote a different mark. Those marks show up again in pay rates and shift assignments. There is a straight line between a mark in the matron's private book and a woman being pulled off day crew to night crew for 2 weeks, and no one can tell me that was for health. Dr. Reeves was not the kind of villain who sneers. He was an average small coast physician with a diploma on the wall and a family in a white frame house 4 blocks from the cannery. He did not invent the registry. He gave it the cover of medicine, and then he stayed in place long enough to make sure it became ordinary. It is easy to hate him because his name is on everything. It is harder to look at the superintendent, the deacons, the aldermen, and the quiet machinery of punishment they built around the women they paid by the hour. The registry was not a secret ritual. It was an administrative process, and that is why it lasted 6 years. Back to Anna. On her 3rd day, she was told to carry a parcel to the river room after the evening bell. The parcel contained bolt cloth and a new ledger. The lantern had already been lit. The matron stood with the leather envelope in her hand. The doctor was late, which is why Anna saw the matron do something I can only describe as practiced. Corinne slid 2 pink cards out of the envelope, pressed the corner of one against the lantern glass, and watched the color brown a shade. She then slipped that card into the stack for a woman who had returned her paper dry every Sunday. It is here, in this small motion, witnessed by a 19-year-old, that the registry starts to look less like sanitation and more like a market. If the matron could darken the color on a whim, she could move a woman from day shift to night shift at will. If she could move her, she could offer to move her back. If she could offer to move her back, she could ask for something in return. The cannery never wrote down what was asked in return. They never had to. The women knew. If you were marked S and found yourself coming again and again to the river room for small errands and late checks and new signatures, the matron would eventually tell you what she wanted. It was always couched as help. Bring this. Carry that. Stay after to tidy. Stop by the office after the whistle. Stay calm and do not make a fuss. The men who showed up in that office at close were not always the same, but they were always known in town, and always married, and always paid in cash. The fact that this is not written in any ledger is exactly why the pink cards were so neat, why the letters were so clean, and why the envelopes were so carefully slipped into trunks rather than handed across desks. I can hear the objection forming. This sounds like gossip hardened into legend. But gossip does not produce a second ledger with fine pink dust trapped in the gutter where the pages meet the spine. Gossip does not put the doctor's initials on the doc sheet beside entries that have nothing to do with health. Gossip does not explain why 3 names on the registry suddenly disappear in April 1909, while their trunks are still listed in the boarding house inventory for 2 more months. Gossip does not leave a single photograph of the river room with its shutters half latched and the lantern bracket white with salt, and yet here the photograph sits in the county archives, mislabeled pump house, until someone who had been there put her finger on it and said, "No, that is where they took us." You want one clear moment that proves the shape of the thing. It comes on a Friday in June when the superintendent enters a fine of $5 against the name Anna Morales with the note discipline failure. $5 was more than a week's pay on the line. The ledger does not say what the failure was. The boarding house notebook does. Returned card smudged, insisted it was the rain. That same night, a man who sits on the Lodge Ladies Committee notes a small donation in the amount of $5, anonymous, and the minutes say, received from superintendent. Money goes out of a pocket and into a box, and then into a ledger, and then out as an envelope of help to a cause that makes everyone feel clean. That is how this system worked. That is how it hid in plain sight. Here is the line that will anchor the rest of what you are about to hear. The night those $5 were deducted, Anna went to the river room and found not the matron and the doctor, but a stranger from town, already seated in the chair with his hat on the table and his wedding ring turned inward. The stranger in the chair did not introduce himself. He set his hat on the table, turned his wedding ring so the stone faced inward, and said he was there on lodge business. The matron stood behind Anna's shoulder and said the same sentence she always used when a woman hesitated. Help is given to those who help keep order. Dr. Reeves arrived late, set his bag on the floor, and made a point of washing his hands at the enamel basin with a slowness that said this was still medicine. It was not. The ledger on the table had 2 columns open, discipline and favors rendered. The discipline column carried fines and extra shifts. The other column carried initials. That column is why people who were not on the payroll came through the river room door. What did a favor look like in Bay Saint Augustine? Sometimes it was obvious. Carry a parcel to the office after the whistle. Stay to tidy while the men counted cash. Deliver a note to the lodge room. Serve coffee to visitors who were not supposed to be seen in the boarding house hall. Sometimes it was quieter. Allow the matron to handle your trunk key for inventory, return a color card on demand. Sit in the river room with the door latched while a man asked you questions he had no right to ask, and watch to see if the pink in your cheeks deepened by the lamp. The threats were always practical. If you made noise, you could be discharged for refusing sanitation and lose your week's pay. If you spoke to the wrong person, the company could notify the parish that you had failed the boarder's rule, and your church letter would be withheld. If you had crossed a border to get here, a man could mention your name to the federal inspector on the platform, and your trip north would end in a car going the other way. The registry gave the men who ran the company a scale of pressure as neat as the one the menders used to size wire. A C woman might be asked to carry a parcel. A P woman would be made to take Sunday laundry alone to the river and return after bell. An S woman was given an envelope and a key task. The envelope always contained 2 papers, the color test and a small card titled Conduct, with 3 boxes along the bottom. Punctuality, subordination, cleanliness. The matron marked those boxes with a pencil that left deep grooves. You can still feel them with your thumb. If a conduct card showed 3 weeks of perfect marks and a dry color square, the woman could be moved back to day shift. If either slipped, she was kept on nights. The registry was not a book about disease. It was a switchboard for women's time. I can place names into this system without guessing. The boarding house key log shows the matron signing out Anna's trunk key on a Friday at 6:42 p.m. and returning it at 7:10. That was the night the man with the turned ring came. The same key log shows 3 other names that hour. A woman named Esther, 20, from Biloxi, who would later pawn her cross for train fare. A woman named Lila, 18, who sent $2 home each week and stopped sending it in April. A woman named Zofia, 21, who wrote her name as Zosha on a scrap of oilcloth found in the river room after the fire. You will never convince me that a health inspection required keys for 4 trunks during the hour when the night gang was busiest and the office was empty of payroll clerks. You might ask why the doctor stayed in this room if he knew what it had become. Some men do not change rooms when their job description changes. They change vocabulary. Reeves called what happened in the river room oversight. He told himself he was preventing disease in close quarters by keeping a record of conduct that matched the payroll. He told himself the fines for discipline failure were a deterrent, not a tool. Then he put his initials beside line items that had nothing to do with coughing or fever. One doc sheet reads, Lodge contribution, 50 cents, Dr. R. Another reads, Visiting fee, $1, Dr. R. No one in the building visited a sick person for $1. The only thing purchased for $1 was silence for a week. The superintendent kept himself in the hallway and out of the lamplight, but his handwriting crawls across the paper that matters. When the matron wrote S on a pink card, Pike also added a note on his wall calendar. He used the same pencil for fish tallies and for the women. A mark by a name could mean an extra load for a crew foreman or a visit to the river room for a woman who had refused to hand over her card. Pike smiled easily on hiring day, called girls by their last names like a schoolmaster, and introduced the doctor as if he were a guarantee. He signed every waiver. He never signed a conduct card. That distance is how men like him sleep. The lodge that blessed this order did not meet in secrecy. It met on Thursdays in the back of a feed store with a stove that ran too hot and a shelf of printed bylaws that anyone could read. The lodge minutes contain 2 lines that make their intent plain without a single crude word. First line, Ladies Committee recommends participation in oversight of company boarding house for betterment of morals. Second line, gentlemen of the cloth to be consulted for counsel on orderly behavior standards. The signatures include a deacon, a canning board member, and a sheriff's deputy, who later married into the mill owner's family. After the vote, the lodge sent a letter to the cannery welcoming the committee to the work. The women on that committee sewed aprons and quilts for flood victims and never saw the river room once. Anna learned how the blackmail worked from the person who profited most from it, the matron. It was not a confession, it was training. Corinne took Anna to the river room on a Sunday afternoon when the canteen was loud and the men were at dice. She closed the door and unlocked the tin box. It contained 3 stacks of cards bound with twine, each dyed a different shade of pink by age and handling. Corinne untied one stack and showed Anna what to look for. Pencil marks along the edge, deep grooves from check marks, a faint water stain in an oval shape near the corner. She said that some women will ruin their own cards with carelessness, and some will ruin them with purpose to force our hand. Your job, she told Anna, is to keep house and keep the color true. Anna nodded because that was the safest reflex learned in a week. Corinne then handed her a rule that turned a card into a leash. S women carry this envelope at all times between supper and bell. If an S returns the envelope without the card, she is on nights until further notice. If an S refuses to show the card upon request, she is on the street by dawn. The first time Anna was told to help keep order, she was not asked to touch a card. She was sent to the office with a tray and told to knock at the inner door and wait until a man said, "Bring it." She set coffee and a plate of rolls on the table. Dr. Reeves sat at the desk. The superintendent stood at the window. The man with the turned ring sat in another chair with his hands flat. No one spoke. Anna left the tray and stepped back to the hall. The matron stood there with the ledger open and a pencil ready. She entered a mark under favors rendered and put 2 initials that were not Anna's. No one needed Anna's initials for this system to run. They needed her presence and compliance. That is how coercion stays technically invisible. Not every man who came to the river room wanted the same thing. Some wanted a card. Some wanted to know a name. Some wanted to look through a trunk under supervision because they believed money or letters or keepsakes carried a secret that made them wise to the town's weaknesses. The registry taught men with badges and pins that a woman's possessions were part of the city's order, not her private life. A watch in a trunk could be a bribe, a ribbon could be a promise, a smudged card could be a confession. This is the heart of why the registry lasted. It made ordinary men feel like stewards of something high-minded while they applied force to women who could not refuse. You might be wondering when the scheme crossed from control into profit. The answer is with envelopes. The matron sent small sealed envelopes from the river room to the lodge room with lists of S names attached to initials familiar in town. An S woman on the list could be pulled from the line 15 minutes before the whistle, sent to the office to tidy for a meeting, and returned to her bunk at lights with a new conduct card in her trunk and a fresh smudge on the old. In exchange, the lodge's ladies' fund paid the cannery $5 or $10 for relief. Relief appeared again in the books when the cannery made a token donation to a church roof or a flood drive. The money made a circle through programs that looked clean on Sunday and through a room that did not allow Sunday words Monday through Saturday. That circle is drawn, faint and real, in the treasurer's hand on a ledger that sits 3 shelves above the registry in the courthouse vault. There were cracks, A foreman who was kinder than most refused to send an S from his crew in the rain and told the matron to mark him instead. She did. His docking sheet shows a fine for insubordination. He left 2 months later for a mill in Pascagoula. A sailor from Pensacola tried to force a boarding house door and was removed by 2 dockers and a deputy because the registry kept order inside but could not police the street without help. The deputy who threw the sailor into a wagon is the same man who signed the lodge minutes. He put his hand on a woman's trunk in one room and his hand on a man's collar 2 blocks away and called both law. Anna's second envelope carried something new. Along with the card, the matron had tucked a narrow strip of onion paper with a line of type that read, "Special inspection complete." It was not the printer's face type used for company notices. It was a thin Roman, 5 or 6 point, clipped from a proofing line. That line appears months later on 2 more cards from 2 other women. I can match the tiny nick on the letter E, incomplete, across all 3. That matters because it ties the river room to the press that printed lodge minutes and church programs, which is how printers sometimes learn what no one wants them to see. The man who set that proofing line will appear soon. For now, the presence of type on the cards tells you another truth. Someone expected to defend the river room by calling it administrative, and someone began to leave tiny bits of printed procedure as cover. The color test was the part of the machine that looked least sinful to the men who praised it and most like a choke chain to the women who lived under it. The dye browned if the square got damp, under steam, sweat, rain, or tears. It browned if a woman did laundry too late. It browned if she walked too quickly to the pump, or if the matron held it near the lantern for a count of 3 to punish backtalk. A brown square became a mark in a ledger, which became a shift change, which became an envelope, which became a favor, which became a donation, which became a line on a church program. If you think this is an exaggeration, I can point you to a meeting note where the lodge thanked the cannery for betterment and the cannery thanked the lodge for mutual aid, and both men signed the same evening they deducted $5 from Anna's pay and sent $5 to a fund in the name of public decency. 2 sisters made the first real dent in the system's confidence. They were not brave because they liked danger. They were brave because their mother had soured on the boarding house, moved to a shack near the oyster beds, and forced them to live with her rather than under the matron's list. Their names were Ida and Ruth Fitzgerald, ages 20 and 16. Ida had a C her first week, a P by her 3rd, and an S by her 5th after she refused a request to stay after bell. Ruth had a C until she visited the river room with her sister on a Sunday to help tidy. The matron wrote S on Ruth's card that same night without an exam. The sisters wrote the first clear sentence anyone in Bay Saint Augustine wrote about the registry. It is on a paper they carried to the courthouse a year later when the cannery office burned. The company grades girls and sells the grade. Before they wrote it, they tested how far the registry could reach beyond the boarding house. They worked 1 week from their mother's shack and came to the line clean. The matron visited them there at dusk with 2 envelopes and a remark about how the company owned the bunks, whether or not you slept in them. Dr. Reeves followed a day later to ask whether they had developed any cough. The superintendent came himself 2 days after that, did not enter the shack, and told the mother that if her girls did not keep regular order, he would charge the family for the cost of replacing 2 ruined bunks. The bunks were empty. The charge appeared anyway on the payroll. The sisters learned that the registry did not measure health. It measured reach. So why did Anna not run like Mavis Dunn? because Anna had a cousin who told her to keep her head down, and because she sent coins home in a pasteboard box every week to a mother who counted them on a table by lamplight. Because the registry turned leaving into losing. Because the matron could write discharge, and the ladies' fund could whisper fallen without moving their lips, and the lodge could put a line in a minute book, and a deputy could find reasons to step in front of a woman on the way to the station. This is how a file becomes a wall. Now I will give you the page that explains the blackmail ring as plainly as any confession would without a single hot sentence. Property log, September 1908. River room, contents, tin lockbox, leather envelope, lamp, ledger, 428R, spare ledger, 3 stacks cards. Envelope replaced 9/14 after incident. Payroll, same week. Special labor, fire crew overtime, records shed. Lodge minutes, same week. Thanks to Messrs. P and R for quick response. Ladies' fund reimbursed. The records shed did not catch fire by itself. Someone tried to erase a thing that was beginning to feel like liability. The river room received a new envelope because the old one no longer closed. The night after the shed fire, the matron called Anna with no tray and no parcel. The doctor was present. The superintendent stood in the doorway as if the hallway were unlucky ground. The matron held a blank pink card and a pencil. She told Anna that the company had shown patience, and that patience had a cost, and that the cost would be taken from her if she could not keep order. She then asked a question that the registry had been building toward since her first night. Would Anna prefer to work a set of nights, or to be moved to light duty with the office for a fortnight if she could promise to keep her card dry? The words were clean. The meaning was not. Anna said she would prefer light duty. The matron marked her card with a small check that matches checks in 4 other cases. Light duty meant the office after the whistle and the lodge's initials on the envelope. The river room did not feel like a crime scene. It felt like a desk. That is what kept it alive while fishermen drowned in storms and women bled, and the city built a pier, and the church held suppers for the poor. The registry taught a town to name control as care. That is why you need to see Anna in that chair with a blank card and a man with a ring turned inward and a doctor who washed his hands between columns that had never once asked the right question. Nail. The registry did not grade health. It priced consent. The women called it the catalog because it felt like a store list someone else flipped through with a finger to choose what he wanted. The company called it Ledger 428R and filed it under housekeeping. The lodge called it Morale. The sheriff's deputy, who married into the mill owner's family, called it nothing at all. He just signed the minutes that thanked the cannery for cooperation. The pages do not use hot words. They use marks, initials, and prices. Ida and Ruth Fitzgerald started writing down the prices, the only way 2 poor women can write down anything in a company town. They put numbers in the margins of the only paper they controlled, the back of pay envelopes. Ida wrote 50 cents for a missing spoon that never existed and $1 visiting fee for a visit that had no doctor in it. Ruth wrote $5 discipline failure next to the week. Anna lost a full week's margin for a square that had been browned by the matron's lantern, not by weather or carelessness. They kept the envelopes under a loose floorboard in their mother's shack and listened for boots in the yard before they slid the board back. If a man had found the envelopes, the board would have been called an unlicensed locker, and the fines would have doubled. In Bay Saint Augustine, words like discipline and locker were just reach with polish on top. A printer named Henry Dahl came into the story because of a tiny flaw in the letter E on a proof line that read, "Special Inspection Complete." You saw it at the end of the last chapter. He set the line at his shop on Chartres Street for a church handbill, nicked the E with the corner of his composing stick, and then noticed the same nick in type showing up on cards he did not print. He did not go to the deputy. He had sold the man wedding invitations and knew exactly how close the deputy sat to the cannery books. He went to the county clerk who handled fishing licenses, because that man spent his days arguing with drunken boatmen and had no patience left for polite lies. The clerk did not want a scandal. He wanted to get through summer without a riot on the pier. He told Henry to stop talking and bring paper the county could stack. Henry said he could stack type. The clerk told him to stack names and dates instead. Henry was a printer, not a detective, but printers in small towns know how to make an index out of gossip. He started with the lodge minutes, which he set on Wednesdays, and copied the names of men who signed them. Then he pulled the church programs he printed for suppers and circled the same names when they appeared under "Thanks to our sponsors." Then he walked to the cannery office at noon, asked for a price on canned salmon for a church drive, and read the pay schedule pinned to the wall while the clerk counted change. The initials that governed women's shifts matched the initials that appeared under lodge, "Thanks" and "Church Thanks." The same letters moved from a page with a rule to a page with a hymn, and back again. It was not proof. It was the outline of how proof would look. Ida and Ruth did not know Henry yet. They knew the matron's ring of keys and how the tumblers felt when a door turned. Ida had a way of making her face blank enough to pass any door that wanted intent. She used it to slip down the hall when the bell rang and men shouted for coffee, and the matron braced the latch with her elbow. She mapped the path from dormitory to river room, to office on a piece of flour sack with dots for turns and crosses where the floor complained. Ruth stood outside the office on a Wednesday and counted the men who went in after whistle. 3. The superintendent, the doctor, and a man with a sheriff's deputy's hat who took it off halfway down the hall and tucked it under his arm, because even a hat can be a confession if someone draws it in a notebook. Ida got her hands on a stack of old pink cards because the matron told her to burn them and did not watch the stove. She took one from the middle of each bundle, slid them inside her dress, and fed the rest to the iron belly with both hands, so the matron would hear the clatter and think the job had been done without fuss. Ruth met her behind the privy with a length of string and a tin of lard to smooth the cards flat. They hid the cards where they kept the envelopes. Those cards were not receipts for health. They were a record of conditions the company pretended not to know it kept. Conduct perfect 4 weeks moved a woman back to day shift unless someone else wrote S in a different hand, and the matron followed it with light duty. Light duty meant the office with the inner door. Henry Dahl reached the sisters through a coincidence that looked like luck and was just the way small towns leak. Ruth took a skirt to Dahl's shop because it needed a patch, and he was the only man who kept needle and thread by a composing table. He charged 5 cents and did not look up until he saw the name on her pay envelope when she pulled the coin from her sleeve. Fitzgerald rang 2 bells in his head at once, the oyster bed shack and a rumor that 2 girls were living outside the house. He asked an old man's question to a young woman. Did the collar itch? She understood that to mean, did the matron's hand feel like a collar? She nodded once. He said, bring me 1 thing with numbers on it that you did not write, and 2 things with numbers that you did. She brought him a dock sheet, 2 pay envelopes, and a pink card whose corner had been pressed too close to a lantern. Henry set the pieces on his stone like type. The dock sheet carried Dr. R initials beside fees that did not cure anything. The envelopes carried fines that matched nights Ruth had been pulled from the line, nights when the lodge minutes gave thanks for cooperation. The pink card carried a note at the bottom in the matron's hand, a curt sentence with that nicked E incomplete. Henry made a rubbing of the card with soft pencil on thin paper and tucked the card back where Ruth had hid it. He did not take the card. He took an impression of a nick in type. He made 2 more rubbings off a second card and off a typed line on a church handbill with the same nick. He did not go to the deputy or the lodge. He went to the clerk again and laid the rubbings on the counter side by side. The clerk was not a sentimental man. He did not care about purity or ruin. He cared about columns that could be matched with a finger. He took a ruler out of a drawer and aligned the rubbings until the nicked E sat inside both words. Complete on a river room card and complete on a church handbill. He said the sentence that makes boring men useful. I can read that aloud to a grand jury. Then he told Henry to bring him a schedule of the cannery's night shifts for 3 months, a list of the lodge's Thursday signatures for the same months, and any instance of the word relief in church programs during the same quarter. Henry knew where to find all 3. He was the man who set them in ink. Ida and Ruth were building their own stack with less ceremony and more risk. They needed one thing the printer could not get, a page out of Ledger 428R. They did not plan to steal the book. They did not need the whole book. They needed one page that showed the scheme defending itself with the same words it used to sell itself. Sister, bring your card. Light duty offered. Conduct perfect. Relief. They waited for a night when the matron was at the dock fussing about spoiled shrimp, and Dr. Reeves was at a house call. Ida had watched the matron hide a spare key behind a shelf brace. She took it, opened the river room, lifted 428R from the tin box, and laid it flat on the table. Ruth barred the door with her foot and held the lantern on a steady flame. Ida did not tear a page. She pressed a sheet of thin onion paper across the book and rubbed a soft pencil gently until the headings rose and the columns shadowed. She took only the first 2 inches of the page because a full rubbing would have been obvious. She put the book back, wiped the table with her sleeve, and slid the spare key home. It was enough. The rubbing showed 4 column headers and the word relief at the bottom in the same hand as the conduct notes and the same nick at the edge of the E, incomplete. The sisters carried the rubbing to Henry in a folded slice of bread so no one would reach to feel the paper. He smoothed it on the stone, set a magnifying glass over the nick, and smiled without looking happy. Then he did the one thing that made paper turn into something that could bite back. He asked the clerk to witness the rubbing, the envelopes, and the dock sheet. The clerk wrote a short attestation on the back in pencil with the date, his name, and the time. He did not lock it in the vault. He folded it, put it in an envelope, and handed it to Henry with a sentence printers rarely hear from officials. If I fall in the river, you still have this. The cannery sensed heat days before any badge appeared at a door. The superintendent ordered the record shed cleared of duplicates, and the lodge sent boys to help. Boys meant men who would not ask what a ledger was. They would carry one if a man with a pin told them to. The shed burned a week later, late enough at night that the town could pretend the lamp had been knocked over by a cat, and early enough that the deputy could still get credit for waking the mill to fetch buckets. The matron wrote envelope replaced after incident in the property log. She did not write that a bundle of cards had gone missing that same week. Ida had not taken them. The fire had drawn too many eyes. Someone else had been keeping a second set the matron did not know to count. The deputy tried to close rank after the fire. He visited the clerk and asked whether any irresponsible papers had been filed. The clerk said fishing licenses were orderly. He visited Henry and asked whether any filthy rumors had been printed. Henry said the church programs were clean. He visited the oyster bed shack and asked Ida and Ruth whether they would like to come back into the boarding house where a woman could be safe. Ida said they had a roof. Ruth asked him whether he would like to read a church program out loud and tell her where the money for the roof came from. He tipped his hat and stepped back because he knew a line when a woman set it on the ground between them. The superintendent switched tactics. He offered wages to the sisters if they would stop speaking against morale. He said he would put them back on the day crew, no cards. Ida made him say that twice so the promise would sit in the air where a witness could have heard it if anyone had been hiding behind a stack of tins. Then she told him to write it on a scrap. He did not write. He left. His handwriting only appeared where math made a man look decisive and where sums made him feel like a foreman of the whole town. Dr. Reeves had one virtue in a corrupt system. He could feel when the air changed. He started to check pulses more gently and to leave the river room door open 2 inches when the matron wanted it closed. He told himself this was medicine again. It was not. It was fear. He also began to keep a private list, like men keep a bag packed in case the ferry stops running. Names he thought might talk, names he thought might stay silent, names he feared. Anna's name is on that list with a mark that looks like a question. Ida and Ruth's names are on that list with 2 exclamation points that run into the margin. The list lives in his pocket for a week and then disappears, probably because the matron finds it and burns it, leaving the faint smell of scorched linen behind the clinic curtain for a day. The sisters needed someone who could turn their envelopes and rubbings into a public ask that could not be hushed with a sermon or a boat whistle. The clerk gave them the name of a state labor inspector who had embarrassed a mill 2 counties over by asking for bunkhouse rosters and then reading them aloud in front of the men who slept on those bunks. His name was Jacob Crow. He did not carry a gun. He carried a small rule book and 2 pencils. He arrived without a train of local men behind him because the clerk sent the wire, not the lodge. He walked into Henry's shop, read the rubbings, asked 3 questions, and said the correct sentence to the correct person first. He told the clerk to prepare a request for inspection of the cannery's boarding house records under the statute governing female laborers in company lodging. He did not say the word morality. He said wages, hours, and discipline rules. That is what the statute called them. That is how you punch a door that says private without breaking your hand. Crow then asked for a map and had Henry draw the path from office to river room and from there to the record shed. He did not ask Ida to guide him. He asked her to write what time the matron took envelopes out of the tin box on Sundays. She wrote 7 after supper. He wrote 7 after supper on his cuff. He walked to the cannery at 6:45 with the clerk trailing him like a man who did not want to be mistaken for a friend, and with Henry carrying a wrapped plate as if they were taking pie to a wake. The superintendent met them on the plank walk with a smooth face and a long story about how much his board cared for safety. Crow let him talk. Then he asked to see Ledger 1428R, the property log for the river room, the boarding house register, and the dock sheets with doctor initials. He said nothing about colors or cards. He said he wanted to see the rule that allowed fines to be taken from women's wages for discipline. The superintendent said all fines were for sanitation. Crow asked whether sanitation required a lodge contribution notation next to the fine. The superintendent did not answer. The matron appeared with the ledger in her hands. Crow took it without ceremony and asked what 428R stood for. The matron said housekeeping. Crow read, turned a page, and asked what the S on the pink cards meant. The matron said special attention for health. Crow asked whether special attention for health is why a woman is moved to the office after whistle. The matron said the office needed tidying. Crow asked whether a fine marked discipline failure that matched a lodge donation marked relief was tidy or sanitary. The matron said she would like to see an attorney. The superintendent said the same. Crow did not press. He set the ledger down, took the clerk's prepared form from his pocket, and wrote in clean block letters that the state requested certified copies of ledger pages showing conduct markings, all doc sheets carrying Dr. R initials for fees other than medicine, and the property log pages for the river room during the month of the shed fire. He dated it, handed it to the superintendent, and said the sentence men in small towns remember after a stranger leaves. We will print the request in the newspaper so no one can pretend it was not received. He did not threaten a raid. He promised a receipt in public. The deputy tried to turn the room back into his, out of habit. He said Crow had no authority over the lodge or the church. Crow said he had not asked for the lodge or the church. He had asked for doc sheets, rule books, and ledgers held by a company. The deputy asked whether Crow believed the company sinful. Crow said the statute did not understand sin. It understood wages, hours, and the taking of money under false heads. That answer cut the script the cannery had written for itself. The men had been ready to argue that nothing unclean had happened because the door had been closed and the doctor had washed his hands. They were not ready to argue why a woman's pay had to buy her way off a night shift by returning a square of paper with a color that would never be trusted as dry again. The matron's fingers trembled when she closed the ledger. The superintendent watched that tremble as if it belonged to a stranger. Crow left with nothing in his hands and everything he needed to make the next morning hard. The clerk walked beside him and said he could live with printing a request. Henry returned to the shop and set a notice in the smallest type he owned for the bottom of the front page where the town read ticket prices and church kitchens. Notice: the state labor inspector has requested copies of certain boarding house records and dock sheets from Gulf Consolidated Cannery under the statute governing women workers. The inspector will receive them by noon Wednesday. Any man who interferes is welcome to say so in writing, and we will print his name under it. It was not elegant. It did not need to be. The superintendent called the board that night and used the word hysteria twice the way men do when they want to invite a laugh and then pack a bag. The board told him to cooperate and keep the doctor close. The doctor went home and told his wife that he had a long week ahead. The matron went to the river room and took 3 stacks of cards from the tin box and carried them to her quarters. She set them in a drawer and put a folded towel on top, as if paper could be disguised as laundry. She sat on the bed with the towel at her side, like a child. She did not sleep. At dawn, Ida and Ruth stood on the plank walk and watched the tide carry strips of burned paper from the record shed fire out toward the bay. They could not read the strips. They did not need to. They had their envelopes, their rubbing, the clerk's attestation, and a man with 2 pencils who had understood that the registry did not just change shifts. It altered what a town believed a woman owed to keep a job. They ate bread and sardines and went to the line like ordinary people, because nothing moves men like seeing the women they counted on to be quiet keep cutting fish, while the word notice sits in ink where everyone buys matches. Nail. The catalog did not guard morals. It laundered power through wages, envelopes, and a ledger that called coercion housekeeping. By Wednesday noon, the notice was ink. The town had read it, and standing still felt like an admission. The superintendent brought out boxes as if volume could satisfy a rule written by men who had learned to count. He stacked the boarding house register, a clipped set of dock sheets without Dr. R initials, and a property log with the river room pages lost to the shed fire. He offered the stack to Inspector Crow with the smile of a man who hopes excess paper can fog a lens. Crow turned the smile aside and asked for Ledger 428R by name. The superintendent said it was housekeeping and private. Crow said the statute counted anything used to calculate women's hours or fines as wage records and therefore public on request. The clerk standing behind him coughed once to let the sentence land as policy, not opinion. The matron appeared with 428R pressed flat against her dress, a towel folded over the top like modesty. She laid it on the table and placed both hands on the covers as if the book might leap. Crow did not yank it. He asked her to open to any page where the word discipline appeared. She opened to a page from spring and put her finger on a line that read, "Discipline failure, 50 cents. Initials R." Crow looked at the initials and then at the doctor, who had just stepped into the doorway with his hat in his hand. Dr. Reeves said the R stood for rules, not for his name. Henry, the printer, drew a card from his pocket with a rubbing of the nicked E incomplete and set it next to the dock sheet. The nick matched and the R did not. The room went a degree colder. Crow read down the column and then asked for 3 specific items in certified copy. Every entry where women were moved from day to night as a result of conduct, every dock sheet where Dr. R appeared beside a fee not tied to medicine, and the property log for the week the shed burned. He also asked for the list of women classified S for the quarter. The superintendent said S meant special attention for health. Crow asked how many S women were reassigned to the office after the whistle in that same quarter. The superintendent stalled. The matron tried to open 428R to another page and found Crow's finger resting lightly on the cover. He was not a large man. He had the weight of a rule behind his hand. He did not leave with the book. He left with copies and with a schedule. 3 days, he said, certified by you and the doctor. If you cannot certify, write why. He took the clerk to the newspaper, sat at the composing stone, and wrote a plain paragraph to sit under notices. It listed the items requested and the day due. It named the statute and the fine for noncompliance. It did not use the word morality. It used wages, hours, dockage, and company lodging. People read those words with their coffee like they read weather. The change in the air came from how ordinary it looked to ask. That night, 2 things happened that could not be untied. The matron moved a bundle of pink cards from her drawer into a flour sack, and a boy from the lodge took the sack to the record shed because the superintendent had said everything that could complicate a hearing should sit in one place, ready to explain itself. The shed caught fire again at 2 a.m, and this time the bucket line arrived late. Flames ate the wall beside the shelf where the sack sat. In the morning, the superintendent told Crow the cards had been damaged beyond use. Crow asked for the sack. The superintendent said there was no sack. Henry came back an hour later with a photograph he had taken at dawn. Just blackened boards, ash, and 1 flour sack handle still hooked over a nail. Ida and Ruth did not wait for the hearing. They walked to the newspaper with their envelopes, their onion paper rubbing, and 6 pink cards smoothed under a book for a month. Emma, who had stayed out of this fight until she was sure names would be protected, unlocked the side door and cleared a table. The sisters laid out their stack and said who had asked them to carry which trays on which nights. They named 3 men who had tried to open their mother's door, and 1 who had offered wages without cards if they moved back into the house. Emma wrote only what she could source: dates, initials, dockage, card notations with that nicked E in the corner. She did not print a single adjective. She put a box on the front page with the headline, "What the Inspector Asked," and below it the phrase, "What Workers Brought." Dr. Reeves arrived at the cannery with his medical bag and a face the town read as tired. He went to the clinic, closed the curtain, and wrote a letter in a firm hand. He wrote that he had allowed himself to be used as a sign for order in non-medical matters and that he regretted it. He wrote that any fee marked Dr. R on dock sheets not tied to treatment had been entered by others and that he had not objected when he should have. He named the matron, the superintendent, and the lodge men who had spoken to him about oversight. He did not use the word blackmail. He used the phrase not necessary for health. He took the letter to the clerk instead of the deputy. The clerk read it, folded it around a pay envelope with 2 nicked rubbings, and locked it in his desk. He told Reeves to keep the original and to bring it signed to the hearing. Reeves nodded. He did not go home. He sat on a chair and looked at his hands. The board met in a back room of the bank and tried to make "cooperate" and "contain" into one sentence. The mill owner said the state could not run a cannery. The deacon said the church could not afford a scandal. The alderman said the pier could not carry more men if the plant closed for a week. They all agreed to sacrifice 1 piece to keep the board whole. They voted to dismiss the matron for cause and to praise the doctor for his service while accepting his resignation. They also voted to accept Inspector Crow's schedule and to deliver copies as requested. The superintendent telephoned the lodge. The lodge sent back a note with no signature. Remember the roof and the flood. The board put the note under the ledger and pretended it was a blotter. Crow held the hearing in the council chamber because it had chairs, a clock, and hooks on the wall. He put the newspaper notice on the table with his request and the cannery's copies. He swore in the clerk and asked him to read the request aloud. Then he swore in the superintendent and asked him to sign his name under the copies he brought. The superintendent's hand shook. He signed. Crow asked him to explain S and the phrase "light duty" in the ledger. The superintendent said S meant special attention for health, and light duty meant less strain on a delicate constitution. Emma stood and asked to read a sentence from a pink card into the record. Light duty offered, card to be returned dry. Crow let her. The phrase did not mention health. It mentioned dryness. That word did more in the room than anyone's sermon had done all season. Crow called Dr. Reeves. Reeves read his letter. He said he had not kept 2 sets of books. He said he had initialed dock sheets when asked and had allowed his initial to stand for the word rules. He said discipline had been used as a head for things that were not discipline. He looked at the sisters and then down. Crow asked him one question. Could a woman's card turn brown by weather or accident? Reeves said yes. Crow asked a second. Did the matron ever hold a card near a lantern to darken it? Reeves closed his eyes and said yes. Crow asked a third. Did a brown card change a woman's wages? Reeves said yes. The council chamber did not gasp. It made the small sound a room makes when a bolt slides back on a door. The matron did not appear. The deputy delivered a note from her attorney that said she was ill and would not attend. Crow issued a written order requiring the cannery to keep all records relating to women's hours, dockage, and discipline available for inspection, and to stop all after-hours examinations not conducted by a licensed physician in a room with the door open and a second woman present. He also wrote a notice to the state recommending a fine and a broader investigation under the statute. He gave copies to the bank, the clerk, and the newspaper. He did not carry a ledger away. He carried a schedule that converted rumor into work. The board chose settlement over trial. They announced that the registry had been mistakenly overbroad, that conduct had been confused with health, and that the company would end all after-hours checks. They offered back wages for dock discipline fees to any woman who presented a pay envelope with the notation in question. They fired the superintendent after he delivered the last certified copy and said he was leaving to care for a relative. The lodge printed a statement praising Clarity and their friends at the plant. The church printed a notice about a roof repair with no list of sponsors for the first time in years. Ida and Ruth kept their jobs through the fall and then left to work in a room where the only ledger they saw measured hours and fish, not women. They took their envelopes and their rubbing and gave them to Emma, who wrapped them in wax paper and filed them in a box labeled Bay Saint Augustine with the note, "Do not destroy." She printed one more piece, not a broadside, just a straight column with 3 subheads: wages, hours, rule changes. She put no names under accusation. She put initials next to the lines where initials had moved money. Anna did not get her $5 back. Her dock sheet was damaged in the shed fire. Emma printed that line too. Dr. Reeves moved inland and set a small practice near a railroad crossing. He did not sign dock sheets again. The matron went to New Orleans. Her name appears once in a city directory, and then not again. The deputy stayed and learned a new habit. When a woman walked by him with a paper, he did not put his hand on it unless a warrant told him to. The cannery brought in a new manager who spoke in numbers and who put a sign over the boarding house rule board that read all fines posted at noon, no exceptions. The state wrote a circular after Crow's report. It required any company boarding house that housed women to post its discipline rules in plain language, to list every dockage head, to forbid after-hours fitness checks, except for illness with a second woman present, and to keep women's rosters available for inspection without notice. It also banned the use of color tests in any context tied to wages or lodging. No one in Bay Saint Augustine hung that circular in a frame. They tacked it up beside the time clock and went back to work because that is what towns do after paper changes their shape. Henry kept a single copy of the newspaper issue with the notice and the hearing. He slid it into a drawer under church handbills and never showed it off. The clerk moved the attestation and Reeves's letter into a vault folder with the label wage cases, not morality. Emma filed the sisters' envelopes with a brass fastener and wrote, in pencil on the flap, the company called it housekeeping. The tide rose and fell. Boats came and went. The river room sat empty for a year and then became storage for rope and tar. You want a trial that names every man and makes a speech. This case did not give one. It gave a line of rules someone could read standing up, a ledger page that stopped being used, a set of initials that stopped appearing, and women who could work a day without bringing a square of paper back dry to pay for the right to sleep by a window. That is what victory looks like in a place built to call pressure order. Nail, the registry fell not to outrage, but to receipts, wages, hours, dockage, and one nicked letter that made the ledger speak.